Every time you turn on your stove to cook dinner, you're tapping into a global supply chain that is currently under immense stress. If you've ordered an LPG cylinder recently, you've felt that stress. The price of this heavy red canister is creeping up, squeezing household budgets. It's easy to look at that receipt and assume this is normal inflation, a temporary bump that will level out once the market corrects itself. But the cost of cooking gas isn't decided in your local market. It is tied directly to massive industrial refineries halfway across the world, heavily influenced by shifting geopolitical tensions. The cost of filling a stove is now a direct reflection of how unstable these global energy corridors have become. Look at how fuel actually travels. When key shipping routes become unsafe due to regional disputes, the massive tankers carrying our energy have to take longer, more expensive detours to avoid danger. While those supply chains are choking, global consumption is doing the exact opposite. Developing nations are building more infrastructure, factories are running harder, and total energy demands are skyrocketing, all competing for a strictly limited pool of raw resources. We hear a lot about the transition to solar panels and wind turbines. Those technologies are growing rapidly, but right now they still severely lag behind the massive, immediate volume of fossil fuels the global economy requires to function today. And for as long as demand outpaces the infrastructure needed to transport it, energy will carry a premium price. This creates a specific, acute problem for a rapidly expanding country like India. As new factories come online and millions of citizens increase their standard of living, the baseline energy required to keep the country running compounds daily. But there is a mathematical vulnerability here. India's domestic reserves of oil and gas are highly limited compared to this explosive rate of growth. This animated diagram breaks down the numbers. You can see India's domestic energy output over here, completely dwarfed by its total consumption requirements on the right. To survive, the country is forced to import the vast majority of its oil and gas, creating a massive dependency gap. When global freight costs jump or oil prices surge abroad, that external cost variable travels straight down the supply chain and violently inflates the cost of India's import requirements. The country's internal growth engine is effectively exposed to external forces it has zero control over. Every time these global supply routes are disturbed and import prices spike, the government faces an unwinnable policy dilemma. This logic tree maps out the two choices. First, we have option A. The government passes the increased cost directly to the consumer. The result is immediate, painful inflation at the local level. You pay more for your gas cylinder instantly. Alternatively, there's option B. The government attempts to shield the consumer by absorbing that extra cost through heavy subsidies, keeping the price of your cylinder artificially low. But option B has a hidden consequence. Absorbing that cost strains the national economy and increases the government deficit. Over time, that debt causes broader, indirect inflation across the entire market, making groceries, housing, and transport more expensive. When costs remain elevated for years, they stop being viewed as temporary anomalies and start being priced into the permanent cost of living. Because the state mathematically cannot engineer its way out of import dependency, consumers can no longer rely on subsidies to shield them from high costs. Eventually, you will always pay the price. Waiting for prices to drop back down to what they were 5 years ago is financially dangerous. What started as a macroeconomic issue involving shipping routes and national debt has officially become a microeconomic liability in your own household. If you keep your wealth in static saving strategies, assuming costs will correct themselves, those savings will rapidly lose their purchasing power. Awareness without adaptation equals guaranteed financial struggle. You need a proactive strategy to survive high energy inflation. Let's call it a smart shift. The first step is energy optimization. Look at your direct interaction with variable cost fuels, like your daily commute to the petrol station, or your home utility consumption. Actively audit those habits and minimize your physical reliance on them. Step 2 is inflation-proof budgeting. We have to stop treating utility costs as variable expenses that might go down next month. You need to budget for them as permanent, high fixed expenses in your household planning. And finally, alternative planning. You need to shift your capital into assets and investments that are specifically designed to outpace inflation rather than letting your money sit idle. These recurring price hikes on everyday goods, act as signals for a much larger structural shift in the global economy. In a world where resources are tightly constrained and global supply chains remain fragile, future security belongs to those who recognize the threat early and aggressively adapt their strategies today. You felt it. You walk into a grocery store or open a utility bell, and the math simply fails. The money in your wallet doesn't stretch as far, and the basic goods you need to survive suddenly cost a premium. When you ask why this is happening, the standard explanation is that prices are rising because of the market, as if these hikes are the natural, unavoidable outcome of invisible economic forces. In reality, markets operate within a specific architecture of human decisions, national policies, and logistical structures. The price tag at your local store is the final domino falling at the end of a long sequence of global events. Behind the abstraction of a market sits a network of national interests. This system operates globally, but impacts your life locally. The market is made up of physical places where agents execute strategies far removed from the people who will eventually pay for them. This is a strategy often hidden from public view. The motives behind a sudden price spike are rarely transparent, even while the financial consequences for your household are immediate. To understand why costs are rising, we have to look past the local storefront and toward the people who design the system. We can trace this through the power chain. This is the hierarchy through which global pricing flows, from massive producers and extraction companies, through corporate distributors, down to governments, and finally to your local market. Large-scale producers at the top of this hierarchy set the baseline for the entire globe by deciding exactly how many resources are allowed to enter the pipeline. Because of the way this chain is structured, a single decision to cap exports or slow production at the top cascades through every lower tier. These decisions take a physical form. On the ground, a top-tier bottleneck looks like thousands of tons of cargo stalled at a port, freezing the supply before it ever reaches a shelf. In this architecture, those at the top make the strategic choices, while those at the bottom absorb the resulting impact. The primary rule of this system is that control over the supply grants control over the price. When resources are abundant, prices stabilize, but tightening the supply serves as a mechanism to force those prices upward. Look at this gas station during the 1970s oil crisis. When global producers restricted the flow of oil, it created a scarcity that forced rationing and financial strain on drivers thousands of miles away. Scarcity is a tool of economic control. This adds a political layer to your cost of living. Governments manipulate the supply chain based on calculated national interests rather than consumer fairness. Global supply is actively managed through international sanctions, trade embargoes, and strategic cartels. A diplomatic conflict or a new alliance formed in a distant capital acts as the hand turning the supply valve. A strategy discussed in a secure boardroom today becomes the inflation you face at the grocery store tomorrow. Ordinary citizens occupy the end of this chain. This is the level where the finalized costs of global actions are absorbed. This hierarchy is why it can feel as though your economic survival is entirely out of your hands. While you are isolated from the decision-making process, you are responsible for paying the bill. You cannot physically dismantle an international supply chain or overrule global trade sanctions, but you can change your relationship to the information. The system relies on the public accepting the market as a mystery. Understanding the mechanics driving your costs strips the system of its psychological influence. When prices surge, you can analyze the geopolitical trigger and observe the supply chain to prepare for what comes next. Global power structures will continue to exist, but a citizen who understands how the system is built cannot be easily victimized by it.